Right. Hello, everyone. This is Nayiri from Low Carb and Fasting. For those of you who are familiar with this channel, you know that I invite a wide range of people, inspirational guests, MDs, dietitians, nutritionists, scientists, citizen scientists as well to my channel. And today's guest is a citizen scientist with an engineering background, who's devoting a tremendous amount of work to nutrition science now. And I'm very grateful for his contributions. He's the founder of Optimizing Nutrition, which I believe is one of the world's largest databases on nutrition and how to optimize nutrition to fit your personal preferences and nutritional deficiencies. Marty Kendall, welcome to Low Carb and Fasting.
So great to chat. Thanks for having me on.
Marty, where do we start? Why don't you just tell our audience, if they haven't heard about you, what brought you from engineering to you would have had a comfortable job, right, as an engineer? What took you into nutrition science?
Been a bit of a change of scenery and completely unanticipated, but my wife Monica has type 1 since she was 10, and we didn't know much about it when we got married and started thinking about having children. It all got very serious, so we started to think about blood sugars and insulin and learnt about how to, like, at that point she didn't even know how to dose carbs with insulin, but then maybe 5 years ago I sort of came across the low carb scene, and then keto blew up, and then we came across Bernstein's group with type 1 grit, and they were very helpful and inspirational. And then we were talking about Jason Fung before, and I suppose I fell in with a passion and a big motivation to understand how to help Monica stabilize her blood sugars and insulin, because just that blood sugar insulin roller coaster is just crazy. And so just kept diving down the rabbit hole to try and quantify things, and I fell in love with nutrition and quantifying nutrition and the ability just to cut through the noise and the confusion and the dogma in all facets of nutrition. So I found it just fascinating, kept on analyzing and blogging and writing, and it's been a really fun journey.
And then later, I think in the last few years, you had another motivating factor, because your son.
Just over a year ago, my son was diagnosed as well. So he's thriving though. So it was a bit of a shock and a bit of grief for a month or so, and then we realized that he knew what to do, and he didn't see it as a problem. He just accepted it and got on and got a whole lot stronger. And he's just set a world record deadlift powerlifting record at 245 kilos at 16 years of age, and he's thriving. So and the technology is getting better and better and better, and the wife's in a closed loop insulin pump system, and he's about to get a closed loop system as well. So that, I mean, it's much easier to manage these days, especially if you dial in the nutrition and stay off the roller coasters.
Well, that's incredible, with 2 type 1s, and
it's very motivating.
And access also to all their data. Can give you a good starting point, I think, to see what happens with type 1s, because I don't think many people understand type 1 diabetes as they should. I mean, even I'm sorry to say, some diabetes consultants just don't understand that, or if they do, they don't really mention all the variables. And so many variables affect your blood sugars. I would love to talk about that. Let's start off with that one. So what are some of the things, whether you're type 1 diabetic or not, whether you're actually diabetic or not, what sorts of things affect someone's blood sugars?
I've just had a fascinating window watching Moni's CGM and closed loop insulin system, just to understand how that constantly responds to keep her blood sugars normal. And it's just giving me a fascinating insight into when the body needs insulin and why, and the different responses. But I initially started getting into like a low insulin load diet, trying to reduce the carbohydrates and even understand the protein effect to insulin. So I think a lot of people understand that carbohydrate requires insulin, but then protein also requires insulin, and most people aren't overeating protein, so you don't need to cut back protein, but definitely if you're on a lower carb diet, you need to understand dosing for protein, and then fat over the longer term also requires some insulin. And then I suppose that the biggest fact that I've come across is just how big you are, and seeing insulin as a anti-catabolic hormone that holds your energy and storage. So I think that's been the biggest revelation for me in all this, is that the way to improve insulin resistance is to improve your body composition, which is true for type 1s and everybody else. So that's given me some insights into a lot of the keto beliefs and low carb approach. And yeah, just because people don't get to live with insulin as something sitting in their fridge and with alongside the glucagon in the fridge, they don't live it. And I've just been privileged to have those insights. But other things that affect blood sugars and insulin, I mean, the time between meals, stress, hormones, exercise. I've plotted my wife's monthly insulin cycles for the last 15 months to understand the different times of her menstrual phase and how the insulin rises after ovulation, and how that can be managed, and just how we can dial that in, and done a blog post on that. And I think that those sort of things are really fascinating and useful for the rest of the population. So I've just gone, I think this is interesting. I'll write another blog post and get it out there to try and give people insights into how to manage and understand what's happening inside their body.
Mm-hmm. There is no good side to type 1 diabetes, but I don't want this to come across as as if I'm sort of undermining diabetes. But I've always said that if there is at all a good side to diabetes, type 1 diabetes specifically, it's that I know exactly how much insulin I'm taking, for my needs. I can see the insulin, whereas if your body was producing it, you wouldn't have a clue. You wouldn't know how much insulin your pancreas was pumping. So, okay, so it's let's talk about insulin now. So we do need insulin for protein, and that's
definitely.
I'm surprised, because before I found out the low carbohydrates sort of diet, I was given a formula.
Yep. Which didn't include
some
protein.
Days. They don't work on other days. In fact, most of the time didn't work. A formula for a ratio of carb to insulin to carb ratio. And I followed that diligently for years, never achieving good or normal glycemia. And I was never told, actually, that that protein also could need dosing for. Why don't we talk about dosing for carbs and dosing for protein, and what impact fat makes?
No, that's all very complex and interesting topics, and a great question. I suppose most of the time, most people are on a high carbohydrate diet, so they go, well, the insulin for the protein is negligible compared to all the carbohydrates that people are eating. So the dominant insulin requirement is for carbohydrate, but once you drop carbohydrate, then there is a need for dosing for protein over a longer period, maybe 6 to 8 hours, and gram for gram, you need about half as much insulin over the first 3 hours. But the often confusion there is a lot of people say, protein requires insulin bad, and therefore I'll avoid protein. But that's definitely not the right way to go, because most people aren't overeating protein. And the rest of my satiety analysis really shows that protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So if you're getting plenty of protein and not too much carbs or fat, then you're going to be more satiated. You're going to eat less. You're going to have less body fat, and therefore you're going to need less basal insulin. So that's been the big revelation for me, is moderating your carbohydrate to achieve stable blood sugars is really important. Getting the insulin right for your protein is really important, but probably the most important thing for most people, type 1 or everybody else, is to get the best body composition they can, which is lower fat, eating enough protein, resistance training to get enough muscle and get that balance right. So then they're really insulin sensitive. And I suppose with the fat, over the longer term, fat does require some insulin, maybe over 12 to 16 hours. It metabolizes a lot more slowly, and you'll see that when you have a higher fat meal, you still need protein. But the fat on your body also requires insulin to just hold in storage, because if you as a type 1 diabetic had no insulin, no basal insulin, you'd just disintegrate into your bloodstream. So, and as you showed on your recent blog, like your dominant insulin is for your basal insulin. It's the insulin to hold your body together. So that's the primary focus for me, is like, let's definitely dial back your carbohydrate to achieve stable blood sugars, because that blood sugar insulin roller coaster really sucks, and you can't get anything else right if you're on this roller coaster that you're always eating yourself out of lows, which is awful. But then the focus is, well, how can I reduce my basal insulin, which is a matter of eating nutrient dense, high satiety foods that will enable you to get better body composition and have less basal insulin, which is, for people on a lower carb diet, 70-80% of the daily dose. So that's the main focus, I think, for most people, be they type 1 or anybody type 2, or everybody who just needs to lose a bit of weight.
Marty, I'm fascinated by your site. Please, people, I will put the link below. You have to visit Marty's site.
Thank you.
If you're a good reader, you prefer reading to podcasts, it's all in there, detailed and comprehensive, sort of blogs on anything from meal plans to how to optimize nutrition, how to make it work better for you, personalized food lists. And, Marty has blogs on food deficiencies, intermittent fasting, weight loss, anything you can think of. Quite a lot of it is actually free access, open to everyone. So tell us about, what your site, how people can navigate your site.
Yeah, it's just a whole ton of blog posts that have developed over the years in different areas. So just go to Optimising Nutrition and work through the blogs, and there's different categories on insulin resistance and nutrient density and satiety and different types of diets, and all the passion projects I've been through over the years, trying to bring an engineering quantified approach to a lot of the controversies that I see in nutrition and the confusion out there. There's a lot of it, and a lot of beliefs in nutrition. And from way back, I grew up as a Seventh Adventist, which you talk to the Fetkes, and they're the center of dietary dogma and the generation of a lot of our modern dietary beliefs. So I think that's given me an interesting background to go, well, I don't really trust the dietary dogma, because I know where it came from. I know it's based on a belief system that's not really about human health, and that's just sort of flowed on through all of our nutrition. And then I've got a wife and a son, and I'm able to quantify things and take an engineering approach to it. So I take no prisoners in trying to come to a clarity and a precision with nutrition that enable people to get the results they actually want and cut through the dogma.
It's interesting with when you mentioned your background. How did you? Was it challenging to sort of to go against the dogma? I feel like.
Yeah, my family was Seventh Adventist, so they left the church when I was 10. So for me, it was not a big deal. But I suppose just growing up in that environment, I understand where those beliefs come from, that have really flowed into our modern nutrition guidance and really formed the basis of our modern nutrition guidance, that it's about not eating animals and more plant-based. And they've been trying to prove that actively through the research for quite a while, and it's hard to unwind that no matter what studies come up. So I've just gone, well, let's look at the data, let's look at the you know, the blood sugars, and see what actually works and see what actually leads to greater satiety. Has been the greatest quest for me, is to look at not just the macros but the micronutrient combinations that enable people to basically get what they need from the food they eat, so they're satisfied and their cravings are killed. So, you know, it's like, okay, everybody should believe that nutrition is about nutrients, and then the question is, what foods provide the nutrients that we need? And that's a very simple question, and you can answer that from a carnivore perspective or a vegetarian perspective or a plant-based perspective or a low carb or a low fat approach. You know, whatever you want to do, you can take a quantified approach to make sure you're getting enough nutrients, no matter what your preferences or current belief paradigms around nutrition are.
I like that about your site, because your primary goal is to optimize nutrition.
Yeah.
It's an approach to personalized nutrition. So you want to help people, whatever their belief system, to get the maximum amount of nutrients into their diet to achieve satiety. You see, I think when it comes to satiety, the question of satiety, we've always been wondering whether it's the whether it's the protein or the fat, and there's this big debate, and it's still not settled. I've asked many of my guests, and they've given me various different answers. But I love it that you mention not just the macros with respects to satiety, but also all of your micronutrients. So do you believe that it's a combination of all the macronutrients and the micronutrients that will give you maximum satiety?
Yeah, basically, it's a matter of balancing the nutrients we need in food with the energy we need from food. And most of us have swung to the other extreme, that we're getting way more energy from fat and carbs together and not enough amino acids and minerals and vitamins. So it's just a matter of saying, where are you now? And let's nudge it in the other direction a little bit to get something you can sustain, and you'll get sustainable results and changes over time. Everybody wants to go from, you know, one extreme to the other, from low fat to high fat and low protein to high protein. But as soon as they do that, they go, oh, I hate this food and I can't stay on this diet, and I'm hungry because I just went from 10% protein to 60% protein overnight, and it doesn't provide enough energy at that point. So you've just got to find that balance point where you can nudge yourself through progressive overload in the right direction and get to sustainable results. So that's, you know, I've designed the sharpest, shiniest knife to help people get the precise results they want. But, you know, optimal is a goal and a direction you need to head in. You can't live on optimal all the time, because people are living on, you know, liver and spinach, and, you know, most people don't want to live like that forever. But you can say, well, what I'm eating now, and how can I incorporate more nutrient dense foods? And they go, oh, I like living like this, I like eating like this. I've improved my current diet, but it's still a lot like my current diet, and it's sustainable is the main thing. So yeah,
I guess, Marty, at this point, I think the most important question is, how do you gauge optimal nutrition? What did you base it on? Because the RDAs, right, the recommended dietary intakes, I think that's what it stands for. So they're the minimum. They're not the optimal range.
They're the minimum to prevent diseases of deficiency and death, basically.
And I think you mentioned it before. They were first written during World War II to prevent severe nutritional deficiencies. They do get updated every 3 or 5 years.
But they haven't changed too much.
But they're still just the minimum. So how did you go about it? Because how do you know what the optimal range is for each of our macro or micronutrients?
Yeah, fascinating question. We've got 140,000 days of data from 40,000 people who have used nutrient optimizers, so we can see the relationship between protein percent, fat percent, carb percent, to see how each macronutrient responds to changes. So what we see with protein, definitely the biggest lever in satiety in all of nutrition, as you go from 10% to 60% protein, you get a 60% reduction in calories. So it's a massive reduction if you could get to that point. But as I said, most people don't want to get all the way there. They just need to move from where they are now to nudge themselves a little bit up the path to get greater satiety. Most people are living on maybe 10 or 15% protein. If they got to 20, 25, 30% protein, they get much greater satiety in a diet they still enjoy without swinging to the extreme. With carbohydrate is completely fascinating. Like the peak of intake aligns with about 45% carbohydrate with the rest from fats. So think cookies and cake and croissants and all the comfort foods that people love to sell us, and that's where the lowest satiety response is. It's not that fat or carb is bad necessarily, it's the combination of fat and carb with low protein and fiber that we tend to overeat. And then, you know, people say eat fat to satiety, but fat as a isolated macronutrient isn't particularly satiating according to our analysis, but it's hard to separate fat from protein. So you just need to find the balance between getting enough protein with enough fuel from fats. So rather than swinging from one extreme to another, it's like, let's nudge up your protein and maybe dial back your fat if you've got fat on your body that you want to use. And then the micronutrients, it's a matter of going, well, each micronutrient, as you get more, say, potassium per calorie, we tend to eat less. As you get more magnesium per calorie, we eat less. So it's a matter of saying what's the 85th percentile intake, which is an achievable intake in our optimizers, but it's a bit of a stretch. So that's sort of the stretch target, the optimal nutrient intake. And then for vitamins and the like, we tend to see, because there's so much supplementation, like it's a lower level. So where the satiety response sort of starts to level out, then we say, well, that's the optimal intake point. Yeah, so in the Micros Masterclass, we set these goals and people try to get enough, you know, vitamin A and B12 and all the micronutrients, and they look at the nutrients in their diet that they're not getting enough of and try to fill those gaps.
So talking about the micronutrients, Marty, I think you say that, you know, your calculations are based on micronutrients per serving rather than per calorie. Why is that, and what's the difference?
There's two different ways to look at it. If you look at nutrient density per calorie, you tend to get the green non-starchy veggies, the spinach, asparagus, you know, broccoli, those sorts of things that have got a lot of micronutrients with very few calories. But with our data, we can then look at the typical serving size. And if you look at micronutrients per serving that people actually eat, then it tends to be the meat and seafood that tends to be more nutrient dense per serving. So you could say, yeah, well, spinach is really nutrient dense per calorie, but how much spinach can you eat? You've, you know, 100 grams of spinach is a lot, and most people don't eat that much, and they get indigestion if they do try. And you might have gone through, you know, only 50 calories, and what are you going to do with the other 2,000 calories that you need for the day? What are you going to eat? If you're eating Doritos with that, then you've shot yourself in the foot. So we say, well, let's look at where you're getting your protein, make sure those foods have plenty of nutrients as well, and then you can fill in the gaps with those nutrient dense foods per calorie, which tend to be the green non-starchy veggies.
Marty, do you differentiate between, say, I don't know, protein that's more bioavailable, or protein from, I don't know, plant foods, for example, and some other nutrients as well, like, you know, D2 and D3 and stuff like that?
Yeah,
so how
definitely.
do you differentiate between what's bioavailable? Do you put them all in the same group?
Yes and no. Like if you're getting plenty of protein from a mixed diet, it doesn't really matter too much if some of that is from plant-based sources, because, you know, you're getting plenty of protein. Similarly, if you're getting plenty of vitamin A or whatever from a mixed source. Some of it may be more bioavailable, some of it may not, but you're still getting plenty because you're getting, if you're exceeding our optimal nutrient intake targets, then you're getting heaps anyway. So you don't need to worry about the bioavailability. But if you're on a more obscure diet that excludes particular foods, then hey, yeah, if you're only getting vitamin D or vitamin A from a plant-based source and it's not as bioavailable, then that can become an issue. So you've got to look at, hey, I'm low in these nutrients and they're probably not bioavailable. So let's dive into that a little bit more. But the first step is really making sure you're getting plenty of all the micronutrients, and then you're probably fine at that point. You don't need to dig any deeper. So unless you're on a strict plant-based diet, then it's not necessarily a big problem.
And if someone is strictly plant-based,
yep,
you do have a whole list of supplementation that may be.
Yeah.
What are some of the supplementations that are other than the B12, which I think many already do take? But what other deficiencies have you found in pure plant-based people?
Definitely the vitamin A, B12, omega-3 is typically harder to get on plants, and those nutrients tend to be less bioavailable from plant-based sources as well. So yeah, if you choose to be plant-based for ethical, religious reasons, then yeah, you need to think about, where am I getting those foods and do I need to supplement them?
Okay, let's talk about satiety. So you see, for some people, from my experience, it's the volume of food that gives them that. They look at a full plate, literally just overflowing with food, and they go, I'm going to be satisfied. And they somehow are, but just the sheer volume of food they're eating. Is there any science behind it?
Yeah, there is. What you're talking about is energy density, and there's a lot of research into energy density. Lower energy density foods tend to be more satiating, but a lot of those studies are based on, how full do you feel after eating that meal, and then how much can you eat at a meal 3 hours later. So you're really only looking at short-term satiety rather than satiety across the whole day and for multiple days. So that's where our data, 140,000 days of data from 40,000 people, looks at the trends in dietary patterns that enables people to be more satiated across the entire day. A lot of the time, the lower energy density foods are low fat and even lower protein. Like they're talking about watery soups and the like, and you might feel full after eating the soup, but how long does that stick with you? Do you feel ravenously hungry 3 hours later, 4 hours later, 5 hours later, and then you're face down in the donuts because you're extremely hungry because that didn't stick with you? So our analysis shows that protein and fiber and particularly the minerals tend to be more satiating. So if you're getting plenty of the nutrients your body needs, then your cravings decrease across the whole day. And those foods, if you're getting more protein, fiber, and minerals per calorie, they also tend to be a lower energy density food. But definitely the priority needs to be on getting your protein and fiber and nutrient density rather than just diluting everything you eat with a whole lot of extra water to make it high volume or low energy density.
So we'll talk about energy density. What exactly are we talking about?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that's one of my questions when people talk about energy density, because when you think of energy density, it's like, well, it's the calories per volume of food, but we don't measure the volume of food because we don't dunk it in water before we eat it to measure the water displaced. So generally it's the calories per weight of food. So a bulky food, the vegetables, the watery soups and the like tend to be those that they talk about mixing, making, rather than eating rice, you make a rice soup and those sorts of things to absorb the water, which then decreases the energy density. But I think that'll help in the short term, but I don't think it'll help in the long term based on our data, or it shouldn't be your primary focus.
Let's talk more about satiety. So there's short term and long term. Let's explore that further, because you already mentioned that.
I just, you want to be full. Like, a lot of people go on a low carb diet and go, I'm just not hungry anymore, and that's a lot of the magic of it, is that once you get out of that danger zone of fat and carbs together, that you get a dopamine hit from the fat and the carbs, and when you bring them together, you get this super physiological dopamine hit that you go, I love those foods. And it's like our body's saying, winter must be coming, I need to eat more, I need to fatten up, and I need to binge on these foods. And whether by good science or just the food manufacturers knows what sells, we love to eat those foods, and they love to sell them to us because they're just full of flour, sugar, and industrial seed oils with flavors and colorings and a few smattered fortified vitamins. So it's a win-win for everybody other than the obesity epidemic, basically. So yeah, that's the thing you need to avoid. It's the fat and carb together, which is the formula for modern ultra-processed junk food.
Okay, so how do we optimize? But before we talk about optimizing someone's diet, but what are some of the most common nutritional deficiencies you found from your thousands of database points?
Yeah, well, we definitely have the greatest cravings for protein. I think just the general population is under eating protein, and the typical protein intake aligns with the minimum satiety, the maximum intake of calories. So just nudging that up is a big deal. And then calcium, sodium, potassium all seem to be very valuable. That if you can get those from the foods you eat, and they'll tend to be in the non-starchy veggies that you'll eat with your protein. And also fibrous foods tend to be more satiating. They just have a lower energy density, tend to be more bulky and harder to overeat. So they're the big ones. And then all the other nutrients seem to play a more of a background role in the picture.
So what are some of the deficiencies you find that people have? Is B12 deficiency, for example, or iron? Are they pretty common?
Yeah, we don't do a lot of testing in people. I think a lot of people strictly adhering to a plant-based diet might be deficient in the B12. That is fairly prevalent. A lot of plant-based people will have to supplement. If you're on a vegetarian diet, the protein can definitely be harder to get. So they're emphasizing low-fat dairy to get enough protein and the like. So.
Okay, so it's no surprise that most people seem to be under eating protein. I've had many guests, many MDs who've mentioned exactly the same thing. Most people seem to be protein deficient. What would you say about the link between protein deficiency and insulin resistance? Is there any link?
It's definitely massive. I mean, the insulin resistance is really a matter of energy toxicity. It's not insulin toxicity, it's really energy toxicity, that your body's having to hold too much energy in fat and glucose in your body, and your pancreas has to keep working and working and working to produce more insulin to hold that in storage. So if you've got more muscle, more lean mass, and less fat, you've reversed your insulin resistance. So it's all about playing that game to rebalance your, have I got enough lean mass and muscle, and have I got too much fat, and bringing that down. So resistance training, eating protein, sleeping, living a low stress life, getting plenty of activity, walking, will all help move that needle of better body composition, more muscle mass, lower body fat, and that'll improve your insulin resistance, and your body will need less insulin. And you've seen it when you were doing your fasting experiment, your basal insulin requirements plummet and go through the floor, and anytime my wife or son are losing weight intentionally, their insulin requirements just absolutely go to pretty much zero. So the best way to reverse your insulin resistance, lower your pancreas's requirement to produce insulin, is to eat less and find a way to do that sustainably, which most people can't. So they have to, it's about eating foods that provide greater satiety, that have more nutrients that your body's craving.
I guess that's one reason why people, on top of obviously the regaining insulin sensitivity, why people are adopting the carnivore diet now. It's not for everyone, certainly, but it seems to work for a lot of
definitely
people.
Gives you lots of bioavailable protein.
Especially for those, I think, who suffer gastrointestinal issues and they can't digest fiber. And they seem to be, intolerant. If you're intolerant to dairy, intolerant to certain other inflammatory foods, you're in a really tricky situation. So meat seems to be the food that heals and that gives you the maximum nutrient density, right?
It definitely gives you maximum protein and bioavailable protein. There's probably a number of nutrients that muscle meat alone might not give you, with vitamin K1 and maybe even B12 and vitamin A, and a little bit of liver to add to that will help. And once you can tolerate it, some non-starchy green veg might help as well later on if you wanted to add to it. But yeah, the carnivore diets are definitely a great elimination diet for people who have been eating trashy, ultra-processed food that creates it overgrows the human, and it overgrows all the bacteria in the gut that creates a really bad milieu in the gut that leads to a lot of intestinal issues. And so just giving your body meat, protein, really helps a lot of the time dial back all that intestinal overgrowth and improve leaky gut.
What would an optimal sort of meal look like for for a carnivore? You already kind of made references to that. So muscle meat, but maybe also including organ meats, right?
Adding a little bit of organ meats will help round out the nutrient profile of the carnivore diet, but you only need about 30 grams of liver a day to really maximize the vitamin A and B12 that liver contain.
How about vegetarian diets?
Vegetarians in our programs tend to, obviously a lot of vegetables, but then vegetarians can eat the dairy, so eggs and low-fat dairy like cottage cheese seems to be really popular. Some of the people who have done really, really well in our micros masterclass use a ton of cottage cheese for their protein. So India is a massive epidemic of diabetes there because they tend not to they're all vegetarian predominantly and not getting enough protein. So getting enough dairy in their diet is really important.
And vegans, what would an optimal plate look like for a vegan?
It definitely becomes more challenging, and then you're looking at tofu and soy protein. The soy protein powder can definitely be useful, and then a lot of veggies on top of that. I suppose the challenge with plant-based, it's such a wide open definition that you could be eating low oil, lots of vegetables, and stacking a plate high like you talked about with really nutritious, satiating vegetables. But that could also be sugar, refined starch, and industrial seed oils, which is the formula for a hyperpalatable ultra-processed diet. So I think it's plant-based. You need to say, well, I'm going to focus on nutrients on my plant-based diet to make sure I'm getting everything I need and optimizing that as much as I can, and then looking at, do I still have gaps, and do I need to supplement with omega-3 and B12 and those other things that are really hard to get on an exclusively plant-based diet.
Okay. How nutrient dense is fish as opposed to, say, poultry or red meat. So how do we compare these three sort of protein sources?
Yeah, seafood kills it basically. It's hard to go past seafood in terms of nutrient density. Not only does it contain the protein, it's got the omega-3 and a lot of minerals, especially selenium as well. So yeah, seafood is often the most nutrient dense, but it's also expensive. Not everybody likes it. So meat, beef is a great alternative as well. Chicken is okay, but maybe not as good as beef potentially, just because I think the chickens are often raised in captivity in small cages, getting a whole lot of less optimal food. So if they're not out eating the grass in the sun, living a happy life, frolicking in the green fields like the cows, then maybe they're not going to be as nutritious. But yeah, getting a variety is a good option of poultry, beef, and seafood.
How about pork?
Yeah, pork is actually bacon is high fat, so maybe not as much nutrients per calorie, but lean pork is incredibly full of B1 particularly, and a lot of amazing B vitamins and lean protein. So if you can we'll often get a leg of pork and just chew through it, and this is 60% protein and got heaps of B vitamins and really satiating, and yeah, it's fantastic. So yeah.
Okay, how about beef compared to lamb?
Oh, actually, a well-raised lamb, I think, can be more nutritious. So yeah, I've got I did a chart looking at nutrient density per calorie versus nutrient density per serving, and then satiety index all overlaid to try and illustrate this, just to show. And I think it's useful to show not just this is a good food, this is a bad food, but showing everything on a spectrum from donuts to asparagus, spinach, broccoli, cod, mackerel, beef, lamb. You can see it on a full spectrum, and you can go, well, I'm just going to eat a little bit more optimal and move towards that optimal corner, which I think is a realistic target for most people.
Marty, let's talk about the seed oils, vegetable oils.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still recommended as good sort of sources of or healthier sources of fat. So do you include those in your meal plans?
I mean, if you look at the changes in our food system over the last 100 years, the fat in our diet has gone up by 700 calories per person per day. If you look at the American food intake, which is a massive amount of energy, and most of that's come from industrial refined seed oils, that it's not, I've got my Mediterranean salad with my seafood. I'm going to sprinkle a bit of healthy virgin olive oil on it. It's the ultra processed foods that they've worked out, hey, this is an incredibly cheap ingredient we can throw into every ultra processed food. So if you're eating a massive amount of extra energy from monounsaturated fat or polyunsaturated fat from industrial seed oils, then you can't really say it's healthy. And I know there's a lot of theories about maybe PUFAs are more inflammatory than this or that or the other, and they're better or worse than saturated fat. And I just think we're eating a lot more energy from palm oil, canola oil, safflower, and everything else, that they're just really cheap ingredients in our food, and that's the fundamental problem. So yeah, most people looking to optimize their nutrient density are looking at, well, where's the energy coming from? Where's the refined carbs? Where's the sugar? Where's the flour? And where's the added fat that I don't need? And by dialing that back, you automatically increase your nutrients per calorie, because you're getting plenty of protein and fiber and all the other nutrients. So if you're trying to improve your satiety, it's a matter of, hey, how can I dial back those empty calories from those added fats, sugars, and refined grains, which is just the definition of an Oreo cookie and everything else in the center aisles of the supermarket.
So how do you approach saturated fats?
Yeah, they're really fascinating, actually. Like if you, I think it's the problem with saturated fat is when it's combined in a burger with the fries and the bun and everything else, and you've created this hyper palatable combination of all these different energy sources together, and that's where our brain goes, wow, all this energy in one burger with a beer and fries on the side. I'm just gonna, it's hard to not overeat those foods, and we see a increased intake for saturated fat when it's sort of a mixture with other foods. But when you see it, it's from eggs or beef, or which is predominantly saturated fat, it actually declines. So whether that's because you've got plenty of protein with that food as well, or it's just something your body says, well, I'm not going to overeat that food, because it comes with the protein as well. And yeah, and there's definitely a difference in insulin resistance of saturated versus unsaturated fat, and it seems that you'll become less insulin resistant with non-saturated fat versus saturated fat. You'll become more insulin resistant earlier with saturated fat, but at the same time, our body seems to switch off and say, well, my fat stores are full and I can't store anymore, so I'll stop eating now. Whereas with unsaturated fat, you'll just keep on eating and eating and eating, and then you become type 2 diabetic. And which one do you want? You probably don't want to overeat either, but if you shouldn't be afraid of saturated fat that comes with the protein that you really, really need. So if it comes with a good protein source, then go for it. Whether you need to add a whole lot of extra butter and coconut oil if you're trying to lose body fat, I'm not quite sure.
I think one of the most challenging things, for me at least, has always been, estimating how much fat I'm getting from a portion of, I don't know, steak, for example. And that's just an example. Or how much fat I'm getting from salmon, right?
Yep.
How do we know?
Yeah, I mean,
can you help me estimate, or just give me some kind of a gauge?
Yeah, I mean, salmon and egg and beef are great sources of protein and not really high in fat, so you don't really need to worry. Most people don't need to stress about the fat in their salmon. If they're eating salmon for dinner, full points, it's hard to go wrong with your salmon or eggs. If you do want to dial things in, as we do in the macros and micros masterclass, you get people to track for 4 weeks, and then they can reflect on, hey, where am I getting my carbs that are increasing my blood sugars? Where am I getting my excess fat? Where am I getting my protein from? And wow, it's quite low, and maybe I should eat a few more of those foods that contain it to get more protein. And through that iterative process, you can say, well, what am I eating now? How do I tweak it? How do I improve it? And after 4 weeks, then you've got the foods that you enjoy and want to keep eating, and you don't have to track forever. Because I don't think everybody wants to track forever, because it's a very mundane task, and eating is about pleasure and enjoying your food and not tracking it all the time. But it can be really useful to track in chronometer for a few weeks to understand what's actually in your diet. And most people from a keto background go, wow, no wonder I'm not losing weight. There's all that fat that I was, throwing into my salad dressings and the bacon and the like that they're just overdoing because they thought it was a free food because it didn't raise insulin. And all of a sudden they go, okay, I'm going to bump up my protein, dial back my fat. My carbs are already fairly low. Oh, I'm losing weight. I'm so satiated, and these foods are really hard to overeat. This is great. So that's sort of the process that we guide people through, and tends to work really well.
Some of the foods which are easy to overeat and they're highly calorific are, of course, dairy, cheese, and a lot of people cannot moderate their cheese intake. And of course, nut butters, but also nut flours.
Yeah, definitely.
I recently
peanut butter is my kryptonite.
That actually one cup of almond flour, for example, is the equivalent of like 80 almonds.
Wow.
Really? So, and 1 cup of flour barely makes, almond flour barely makes a small sort of keto or low carb pizza, right?
Yeah.
So no wonder people find, I mean, when I first started low carb, I used to make all this stuff and then noticed that my blood sugar is actually rising.
Yeah. And we went through the same journey.
Cheated? Have they said almond flour on that pack? But it actually contains some flour as well, because that you do find that quite often, right? It says olive oil at the front, and then you find out that there's every other oil, and a tiny portion or 2% of the oil is on the olive oil, right? They say that on mayo jars, right? Mayo, clean mayo made with avocado oil. And you look inside, and then there's just a small amount of avocado oil. And
not many avocados behind.
But I used to wonder what's happening, and then I found out, oh my goodness, that's like I've just had like 80 almonds. Of course, my blood sugar is rising.
Yeah.
So do you find that people tend to overeat nuts, nut butters, dairy?
Totally, yeah. And they're the biggest kryptonite foods for people who have gone, oh, well, I'm not eating carbs, I'm low carb, I'm keto, but the cheeses and the wine and the nut butter, you know, the peanut butter is kryptonite for me. And when I was in my early keto days, it was like, I need to get my ketones higher, so I'm putting peanut butter and butter together and, you know, trying to get my ketones higher. And it's like, oh, wait up, I don't look so healthy anymore. What's going on here? Maybe I'm overeating this stuff, trying to chase the elevated ketones.
And you do find yourself putting on weight as well with those foods.
And then your basal insulin increased at that point. So
Completely.
Not just for you, but for everybody. So yeah, you need to dial in the satiety by dialing back the carbs and the fat while prioritizing protein and nutrient density. Same recurring theme that I end up sounding like a broken record.
I think it's important for people to know. So, so your meal plans, are they different for based on people's goals? So, if someone wants to gain weight, or someone wants to lose weight or maintain their weight, is it targeted for that specific goal?
Yeah, we've created 30 different recipe books with nutrient density at the center, but yeah, we've got everything from therapeutic keto for people who want to get their ketones up for therapeutic purposes for dementia and Alzheimer's or epilepsy, to hardcore protein sparing modified fast, to high nutrient density and plant-based and low carb. And so they're all sort of tailored for different goals based on nutrient density being the central piece. So even plant-based, we said, you know, if people want to eat a plant-based diet, here's what the most nutrient dense plant-based diet looks like, and, you know, go for it. And we've created something that people can thrive on a plant-based diet or a therapeutic keto diet, whatever your preference is. But yeah, for someone who's trying to gain weight or is very active, then it's a matter of dialing back the protein a little bit and dialing up the energy from fat and even carbs to provide that energy in the diet and enable you to eat more. So satiety, you can use it either way. It's, you know, you can have greater satiety for people who want to lose weight, or less satiety, lower satiety for people who need to fuel with more energy. If you're about to run a marathon or do an Ironman, then you just want to get as much energy in as you can, and that donut or the chips or the creamy pasta is the ideal food to just fill the fuel tanks really quickly. But you know, the vast majority of people are somewhere on the other end of the spectrum who aren't lean and they want to lose some body fat.
So for an athlete, what's the optimal what does an optimal plate look like for an athlete who's burning a lot of glucose?
Yeah,
and we know diabetics, right? To go on a 15-minute walk, I notice my blood sugar is dropping. Like, it's only 15 minutes. I didn't do anything. I didn't even like stress my body particularly. Just 15-minute walk from here to, I don't know, nearest shop, and I notice my blood sugar is dropping. So if you're an athlete, right?
Yeah, it depends on the
whatever. So
depends on the type of activity you're doing. If you're doing a lot of explosive, really intense sprint, then maybe a bit more carbs would be helpful. But I think a lot of people tend to thrive fairly well on you know, fueling with fat and then getting just enough carbs to keep the blood sugars up. And if they're getting plenty of fat, they're not really needing to tap into the carbs very often. So it's just a matter of finding that balance based on your activity and your preferences. And a lot of people, it depends, but you might be eating 5,000 calories in a day, so it's quite easy to get your protein because you're just eating so much. So you don't need to prioritize the protein percentage because you're going to get heaps of protein from all that food that you're able to eat.
Marty, I'm fascinated to know or to learn actually if you have both on board, carbs and fat for fuel, and you're an athlete like your son, you're a powerlifter, which one is he burning? Is he first burning the glucose until he runs out of glycogen stores and then switching to fat? What's happening in his body?
Great question. Your body will call on the glucose if you're doing the explosive activity and your heart rate is elevated because it's a more fast burning fuel. And even a low carb person will have a fair bit of glucose in their body because you convert the protein and even the glycerol backbone from fat to glucose to store in your liver for a rainy day when you need it. But really, due to oxidative priority as a general rule, we're using the glucose first and then the fat gets stored up the back ready to be used more when the glucose starts to drop. So that's the fascinating thing of watching two CGMs all day. You can see, okay, blood sugars are dropping, and if you've got enough fat on board, then you can fuel from fat, and it doesn't matter that your blood sugar is low and staying low. That's great because you're using the fat most of the time. So, and I created a data-driven fasting program for people to use their glucose as a fuel gauge to drop their glucose slowly, so they can then turn to use more body fat once they drain the glucose from their body. So that works a treat and works really nicely.
Yeah. Okay. So my next question is about fasting.
Cool,
this channel is called Low Carb and Fasting. We talked about low carbohydrate diet and, in fact, lower fat as well. So low carbohydrate doesn't necessarily mean high fat. But what do you think of fasting?
Wow, the open question. There's a lot of different takes on it. It's been very popular over the years, and I suppose the challenge I saw is that people would just fast forever and then think they could eat anything after they fasted, and it didn't matter what they ate after that fast. And we typically, when we get super hungry, we tend to make less optimal food choices. We go, I can have the pizza and the croissant and the peanut butter for me. And I'd used to, get the peanut butter and the yogurt and just hammer it down after a 3-day fast because I'd earned it. But my body composition wasn't improving. I was probably worsening and feeling sluggish. So I think what you eat afterwards is really, really important. And if you're fasted so long that you can't make good food choices, maybe fasting a little bit less might be wise. So it's about finding that balance. And if you're not getting your protein across the week, it doesn't matter when you eat, you still need to get the protein and the nutrients on a week-to-week basis. So if people are doing the extended fasting all the time, there's a risk that they're either not getting enough nutrients, or they're making poorer food choices when they do eat, and maybe not getting the long-term results that they wanted. So that's sort of my passion around fasting, is making sure people don't push it so long that they don't make good food choices. So you have to find the balance between feasting and fasting and eating well when you do eat.
We've both interviewed Dr. Joan Ifland about food addictions. Lovely. And one of the things she said was people with food addictions tend to go for all the processed foods that they're actually addicted to after fasting. And so it just triggers that craving even more. It's not something that's recommended for people who don't have a healthy relationship with food. But when I do extended fast, and it's like once a year maybe, if that, I do it to regain insulin sensitivity because I notice my insulin sort of intake reduces for at least 3 months following an extended fast. But I don't go to carbs. In fact, I've banned peanut butter. I've banned it from because it's one of those things you would, you could easily just overeat. So I just don't bring it home anymore.
That's very smart.
If I do, it's a treat, like it's a Christmas treat, right? And I do the feasting and fasting, and when I'm feasting, I eat well. I try to get, although it's not always possible, but I try to get a lot of it's literally we sit down at the table and like the French eat, although I'm not French, but the French people would sit like for 3 hours at a family dinner table. They're having conversations and they're eating slowly. So that's the kind of feasting I do. It seems to work for me.
You're looking very healthy and It's interesting as a type 1 diabetic, you can sort of dial back your basal insulin during the fast. So you're able to use more fat during the fast, which is a bit of an extra hack that most people can't do. They can't turn off their basal insulin.
Well, non-diabetics.
Yeah. I mean, you can't really turn off your pancreas like a type 1 can. So,
But surely if you are doing extended fast, then your pancreas wouldn't necessarily produce the same.
Definitely reduce the insulin. But you can just turn it off completely rather than just dialing it back like a healthy pancreas would.
Well, maybe that's another good thing about type 1 diabetes.
There are many.
And not only that exactly how much insulin you're taking, but you can dial it, you can adjust it. But you can't do the same with glucagon, for example. I mean, my pancreas just pumps out glucagon. I just don't know why. What was that in response to? And I mean, that's a whole different topic, for another day. Marty, we talked about fasting, we talked about low carbohydrate diet. Can you tell our audience where they can find you and how they can contribute? And I think it's all anonymous contributions, right, to your site. So how they can help you with your data.
I mean, just check out Optimising Nutrition. If you want to check your nutrient profile, we've got a 7-day nutrient clarity challenge where people can track their food and then upload it to Nutrient Optimizer, and it'll tell them what nutrients they're not getting from their diet and which foods and meals contain them. We've got a data-driven fasting challenge, which just uses your simple old boring blood glucose meter as a fuel gauge to help guide people when and what to eat. It's just so powerful to guide people on food choices and when they actually need to refuel. And we've got a macros masterclass and a micros masterclass just to help people dial in the macros and the micros. And it's just using all the things I've learned from living with 2 type 1 diabetics, and which I think is really useful for the rest of the population at the same time.
Marty, I just remembered one last question. I'm not going to let you go before I ask you that question. Ketones. Why is it futile to chase ketones? Because you talk about, you write about that. It's futile to be chasing ketones. Ketone.
Yeah, my favorite topic. We just don't know whether it's coming from our body fat or the dietary fat that we're eating. So measuring ketones is what does that mean? And a lot of us were chasing elevated ketones by adding more fat, thinking that would turn off our pancreas and enable us to lose body fat. But as we mentioned before, fat is the least satiating macronutrient, and we just end up overeating and gaining body fat, which then requires more insulin, ironically. So ketones are interesting, but getting a lower pre-meal blood glucose really sorts everything out. If your glucose before you eat indicates that you need to refuel, it's a bit lower than normal, then your ketones are probably going to be a little bit elevated, just enough, and that's fine because it's coming from your body fat. And tick, and chasing ketones is just really confusing and I don't think tell you very much, that especially if you've got a glucometer, it's much more powerful to guide when and what you eat.
Yeah, and ketones vary. I mean, the ketones vary, and you just don't know what's happening. You're right. They're more confusing than, than helpful.
And often the most metabolically healthy lean people will have the lowest ketones just because they've got less body fat and glucose, cholesterol and ketones and fat in their blood. So the whole energy levels are lower. So they're going to have lower ketones in their blood. Meanwhile, the people who are a lot heavier are going, oh, I've got these ketones of 3 and 4 and 5, and but that's just potentially because they've got a lot of energy in their body, and it's not a great thing necessarily, but who knows? It's hard to tell what that means. And as people become leaner and more metabolically healthy, the ketones tend to come down. So at that point, what do you do? Do you go, oh, okay, I've lost my ketones, they're at 0.3, 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, that's okay? Or do I go, well, I need to get my ketones up, so I need to drink the olive oil and the butter and the coconut oil to get my ketones up, but I was losing weight? It's just hard to make sense of. So yeah, I think definitely chase metabolic health, better body composition, eat for satiety, nutrient density, and then the ketones will look after themselves.
And eat when you're hungry, or is it eat when your blood sugars are low? Is it, which one do you usually recommend?
Eat when you're hungry, confirmed by your blood sugars. So there's a lot of reasons why we think we're hungry. We might be just dreaming of that yummy thing we had in the fridge and go, oh, I think I'm hungry. But if you check your blood sugars, you can go, yeah, I'm definitely need to refuel. Time to refuel, definitely time for a hearty meal. And yeah, so that just helps a lot of people work out when they need to eat based on actual hard data and retrain their hunger.
Excellent. What an informative conversation. Thank you so much for your time. People, I will put all of Marty's links in the description below. Follow him and support him online. You'll have a YouTube channel as well. So please follow Marty and support his efforts.
Thank you very much.
Marty
Thanks for your time. It's been fun. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye for now.